In the shadows of antiquity, before the rise of steel and the fall of empires, there existed a force more potent than any blade and more enduring than any crown. A force that claimed to bridge the gap between the mortal and the divine while simultaneously forging the chains of earthly subjugation. The history of humanity is not merely a record of progress and enlightenment, but a blood-soaked tapestry woven with the threads of spiritual manipulation, where the sacred was frequently hollowed out to serve the profane interests of those who sought total dominion over the soul and the soil alike. Imagine standing in the heart of the Roman Empire during the 4th century, watching as the once persecuted followers of a carpenter from Nazareth saw their symbols of peace transformed into the standards of imperial legions, marking the moment when faith became the ultimate political currency. This was not an isolated incident, but the beginning of a recurring nightmare where the pulpit was traded for the throne and the divine word was twisted into a mandate for conquest, starting with the chilling realization that the Crusades were less about spiritual liberation and more about the geopolitical chess matches of the medieval papacy and European nobility, seeking to export their internal violence to distant shores. As the sun set over the walls of Jerusalem in 1099, the screams of the innocent echoed not because of a theological dispute, but because religion had been successfully weaponized to dehumanize the other, turning neighbors into monsters and massacres into acts of worship. This dark alchemy of power and piety traveled across the oceans during the Age of Discovery, where the cross preceded the sword into the Americas, providing a moral veneer for the systematic destruction of indigenous civilizations under the guise of saving souls, a process that saw the requerimiento read in a language the locals couldn't understand to justify their enslavement. The Inquisition, meanwhile, turned the quest for purity into a bureaucratic engine of terror, proving that when a state claims to speak for God, dissent becomes not just a crime, but a cosmic betrayal punishable by the stake and the rack, creating a culture of paranoia where even a whispered thought could lead to the dungeons. We must look at the 30 Years' War, a cataclysm that tore Central Europe asunder, where the nuances of transubstantiation and church hierarchy were used to fuel a conflict that was fundamentally about the survival of the Habsburg dynasty and the shifting balance of power, leaving millions dead in a wasteland where the vultures were the only victors. In the East, the mandate of heaven was used to justify the rise and fall of dynasties with the same cold efficiency, while later, the divine right of kings in the West served as a spiritual armor for absolute monarchs who claimed their tyranny was ordained by the heavens. Even as the Enlightenment dawned, the weaponization of faith did not vanish, it merely evolved, finding new life in the justifications for the transatlantic slave trade, where selected scriptures were cherry-picked to argue that an entire race was divinely destined for servitude, a theological corruption that would haunt the conscience of nations for centuries. The script of history shows us that when the boundary between the sanctuary and the Senate is blurred, the result is almost always a tragedy of epic proportions, as seen in the partitioned bloodbath of India and Pakistan, where communal identities were stoked by political elites to carve out power at the cost of millions of lives. We see it in the radicalization of the late 20th century, where ancient texts are weaponized by modern insurgents to create a sense of belonging in a fractured world, proving that the psychological grip of the divine is the most effective tool for mobilization ever devised by the human mind. The tragedy lies in the fact that the most profound human yearnings for meaning and transcendence are the very vulnerabilities that power-hungry leaders exploit, turning the quest for the eternal into a fuel for the ephemeral battles of the present. From the sacrificial altars of the Aztecs, used to maintain social order through fear, to the modern-day cults of personality that mimic religious devotion to suppress democratic freedoms, the pattern remains disturbingly consistent. If you can convince a person that their actions are mandated by a higher power, you can convince them to commit the unthinkable. This narrative is not an indictment of faith itself, but a forensic examination of its hijackers, the demagogues and the despots who realized early on that while a soldier can take a life, A priest king can take a mind, ensuring that the legacy of religious weaponization is one of shattered icons, burnt libraries, and the persistent question of how something intended to offer peace has so often been used to ignite the fires of war. As we navigate the complexities of the modern era, the echoes of these past manipulations remind us that the most dangerous weapon is not the one held in the hand, but the one planted in the heart under the guise of holiness. For once a man believes he is doing God's work, there is no limit to the cruelty he can inflict upon his fellow man in the name of the divine. The historical record is a graveyard of empires that try to build their foundations on the shifting sands of exploited dogma. And yet the cycle continues, because the allure of absolute moral authority is too great for the ambitious to ignore, leading to the inevitable conclusion that as long as there are those who seek power, there will be those who weaponize the sacred to obtain it. We see the scars of this process in the architecture of our cities, in the language of our laws, and in the deep-seated prejudices that still divide us today, all remnants of a time when the pulpit was a fortress and the congregation was an army. The manipulation of the afterlife to control the present life remains the most sophisticated form of social engineering ever conceived, a strategy that relies on the fundamental human fear of the unknown to manufacture consent for the agendas of the known. In the end, the history of weaponized religion is a mirror reflecting our own capacity for both immense spiritual depth and staggering moral failure, a reminder that the tools we use to reach for the stars are the same ones we have used to bury our brothers, leaving us with a legacy that is as much a warning for the future as it is a chronicle of the past. The true test of any civilization lies in its ability to distinguish between the genuine pursuit of the divine and the calculated theater of the powerful, a task that requires us to look past the symbols and the rituals, to see the cold, hard steel of ambition hidden beneath the robes of the righteous. As the centuries pass, the names of the gods change, and the languages of the prayers shift, but the mechanics of control remain the same, proving that the struggle for power is eternal, and that faith in the hands of the wrong master is the most devastating weapon ever forged by human hands. This script of control is written in the blood of those who dared to question, those who were deemed heretics because they stood in the way of a political objective, and those who were simply in the wrong place at the time of a holy conquest, serving as a permanent testament to the dangers of merging the celestial with the temporal. We must confront this history not to disparage the quest for meaning, but to safeguard it from those who would turn our highest aspirations into a means of our own enslavement, ensuring that the lessons of the past are not lost in the fervor of the present. The narrative of faith and power is still being written today in the halls of government and the streets of conflict, a living history that challenges us to decide whether we will allow the sacred to be a bridge to understanding or continue to permit its use as a wall of division and a sword of oppression. It is a story of grand cathedrals built on the backs of the poor and crusades launched for the benefit of the rich, a story of how the whisper of a prayer can be drowned out by the roar of a cannon, and how the light of the spirit can be extinguished by the darkness of the ego, leaving us to wonder if we will ever truly learn that the divine is found not in the conquest of others, but in the mastery of ourselves. The echoes of the past are loud, ringing through the centuries like a bell that cannot be unrung, calling us to witness the moment when the heavens were claimed by the earth and the gods were drafted into the service of men, a tragedy that defines our species as much as any triumph of science or art. In the final analysis, the weaponization of religion is the ultimate betrayal of the human spirit, a theft of the soul for the sake of the crown, and the reminder that our greatest danger often comes disguised as our greatest hope, requiring a vigilance that transcends belief and the courage that dares to demand that the holy remain humble and the powerful remain human.